January 27th, 1991. Tampa Stadium, Florida. The day before Super Bowl 25, and Whitney Houston was standing on the 50-yard line of an empty stadium, staring at a microphone that suddenly felt like an impossible challenge. This wasn't just another performance. This was the Super Bowl, America's biggest stage, during one of the most tense moments in the nation's history. Operation Desert Storm was in full swing. American troops were fighting in the Persian Gulf, and the entire country was holding its breath, caught between patriotism and fear. Whitney had been asked to sing the national anthem, a song that every American knew by heart, a song that had been performed thousands of times, but never under circumstances quite like these. The pressure was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and Whitney Houston, the woman with a voice that could move mountains, was terrified. The rehearsal was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but Whitney had been at the stadium since 9 that morning, walking the field alone, trying to connect with the magnitude of what she was about to do. Her vocal coach, Gary Katona, watched from the sidelines as Whitney paced back and forth, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't stage fright in the traditional sense. This was something deeper. Whitney felt the weight of a nation on her shoulders, and she wasn't sure her voice was strong enough to carry it. "I've sung for presidents, for royalty, for millions of people," Whitney told Gary that morning, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this feels different. This isn't about entertainment. Those boys are over there fighting, maybe dying, and I'm supposed to sing a song that somehow makes sense of all that pain." Gary had worked with Whitney for years and had seen her navigate countless high-pressure situations with grace and confidence. But this was different. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the way her usual pre-performance ritual was disrupted by something that looked like genuine fear. What Gary didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Whitney had been watching the news obsessively for weeks. Every night, she would sit in her hotel room and watch footage from the Gulf War. Young soldiers, some barely out of high school, talking to cameras about missing their families. Mothers crying as they sent their sons off to war. The constant threat of terrorism that had security at an all-time high for the Super Bowl itself. Whitney had internalized all of that pain, all of that fear, and now she was supposed to transform it into something hopeful through her voice. The rehearsal began badly. Whitney's first attempt at the national anthem was technically perfect, every note precisely where it should be, but it felt hollow. Even she could hear it. The power was there, the control was flawless, but the emotion, the thing that made Whitney Houston different from every other singer in the world, was missing. She stopped halfway through, shaking her head in frustration. "It's not right," she said to her musical director, Ricky Minor. "It sounds like just another performance, and this can't be just another performance." Ricky understood immediately what Whitney meant. The national anthem had been performed at every Super Bowl since the tradition began, and most versions followed a similar pattern. Respectful, powerful, but ultimately safe. Whitney was searching for something more, something that would honor not just the song, but the moment America was living through. But as Whitney prepared to try again, something completely unexpected happened. A group of about 20 people had quietly entered the stadium and were standing near the tunnel entrance. At first, Whitney assumed they were part of the production crew, or perhaps NFL officials checking on rehearsal. But as her eyes adjusted to the bright Florida sunlight, she realized these weren't stadium workers. These were United States military personnel, still in their uniforms, and they were here specifically to see her. What happened in the next 30 minutes would completely transform not just Whitney's performance, but her entire understanding of what her voice could mean to people who needed it most. The soldier who stepped forward first was young, probably no older than 22 or 23. His uniform was crisp, his posture military perfect, but his eyes held something that looked like exhaustion mixed with determination. He walked across the field toward Whitney with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had something important to say and wasn't going to let nerves stop him. Whitney, still standing at the microphone, watched him approach with curiosity and a hint of concern. Security moved to intercept him, but Whitney held up her hand, signaling them to let him through. There was something about this young man's presence that told her this moment mattered. "Miss Houston," the soldier said, his voice carrying clearly across the empty stadium. "My name is Sergeant Daniel Kirkpatrick, and these are members of my unit. We're being deployed to the Gulf in 72 hours. Whitney felt her breath catch in her throat. 72 hours. 3 days before these young men and women would be in one of the most dangerous places on earth. "We heard you were rehearsing today," Daniel continued, "and we asked if we could be here. We needed to hear you sing before we go." The simplicity of his statement, the raw honesty of it, hit Whitney like a physical force. These soldiers, who were about to risk everything for their country, wanted to hear her voice. Not because they were fans, not because they wanted an autograph or a photo, but because her music meant something to them in their darkest hour. Whitney walked toward Daniel and the other soldiers, leaving the microphone behind. As she got closer, she could see that several of them were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "Why me?" Whitney asked softly. "Why did you need to hear me sing?" Daniel looked back at his unit, then returned his gaze to Whitney. "Because when we're over there, scared and far from home, we're going to remember this moment. We're going to remember that someone with a voice like yours sang for us, sang for America, and that's going to remind us why we're fighting. Your voice is going to sing us home, Miss Houston." 7 words. Your voice is going to sing us home. In that instant, everything changed for Whitney Houston. The pressure she had been feeling, the doubt, the fear that she wasn't adequate for this moment, all of it transformed into something else entirely. Clarity, purpose, understanding that this performance wasn't about her at all. It was about these young men and women and the millions of others who were watching and hoping and praying for their loved one's safe return. Whitney felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't bother wiping them away. "Thank you for telling me that," she said to Daniel. "Thank you for helping me understand what I'm really doing tomorrow." What happened next was something that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Whitney walked back to the microphone, but before she began singing, she gestured for all the soldiers to come closer, to stand right there on the field with her. They hesitated at first, unsure if this was allowed, but Whitney insisted. "You need to be here," she said, "right here with me." As the 20 soldiers formed a semicircle around her, Whitney closed her eyes, took a deep breath that seemed to come from the very center of her being, and began to sing the national anthem. But this time, everything was different. This wasn't a rehearsal. This wasn't practice. This was Whitney Houston singing directly to people who needed her voice to carry them through the darkest time of their lives. The power that came out of Whitney in that moment was unlike anything anyone had ever heard from her before. Every note carried the weight of the situation. Every phrase was infused with both pain and hope. Every breath seemed to hold the collective prayer of a nation at war. Gary Katona, watching from the sidelines, felt chills run down his spine. Ricky Minor stopped conducting and just listened, knowing he was witnessing something that transcended music. And the soldiers, these young men and women who were about to face unimaginable danger, stood transfixed as Whitney's voice seemed to wrap around them like armor and comfort simultaneously. When she reached the final phrase, "the land of the free and the home of the brave," Whitney's voice soared higher than it ever had before, holding that last note with a power that seemed impossible for any human voice to sustain. And then silence. Complete, profound silence as the last echo of her voice faded across the empty stadium. After that rehearsal with the soldiers, Whitney Houston made a decision that shocked everyone on her team. She called an emergency meeting with the Super Bowl production staff, her management, and the NFL officials. When everyone was assembled, Whitney made an announcement that went against every conventional wisdom about performing at major events. "I'm not lip-syncing tomorrow," she said firmly. "I'm singing live." The room erupted in protests. The Super Bowl was always pre-recorded for the national anthem. It was standard procedure, a safety measure to ensure that nothing went wrong during America's most-watched television event. Technical difficulties, weather conditions, even security concerns, all of these factors made live performance too risky. Whitney's manager tried to reason with her, explaining that even the pre-recorded version would be her actual voice, just recorded earlier under control conditions. But Whitney was immovable. "Those soldiers need to know that what they're hearing is real," Whitney explained, her voice steady with conviction. "Not something recorded in a studio, not something that could be fixed or adjusted. They need to know that in that moment, I'm giving them everything I have, just like they're about to give everything they have for this country." The discussion went on for over an hour, with various people trying different angles to change Whitney's mind. They talked about the cold weather forecast for game day. They mentioned the risk of audio feedback with 50,000 people in the stadium. They reminded her that President Bush himself would be watching, that this performance would be broadcast to over 750 million people worldwide, that one mistake would be replayed forever. But Whitney had experienced something during that rehearsal with Sergeant Kirkpatrick and his unit that had fundamentally changed her perspective. She had seen the look in their eyes when she sang for them. She had felt the connection, the authenticity of that moment, and she knew that what she was about to do required that same level of realness. "I understand the risks," Whitney said quietly, ending the debate. "But I also understand what this moment means. Those boys and girls heading to war, they need to hear truth, not perfection. And the only way I can give them truth is to stand on that field and sing with everything I've got, right there in that moment, no safety net." Finally, the NFL officials reluctantly agreed, on the condition that a backup track would be ready if needed. Whitney accepted this compromise, though she knew in her heart she wouldn't need it. That night, Whitney couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, thinking about Daniel Kirkpatrick and his unit, thinking about all the other young soldiers watching from overseas, thinking about their families gathered around televisions, hoping for some moment of comfort before their loved ones went into combat. The weight of it all was enormous, but unlike the fear she had felt earlier, this weight felt right. This weight felt like purpose. At 3 a.m, Whitney called her mother, Sissy Houston, who had always been her anchor during difficult times. "Mama," Whitney said, "I need you to pray with me. Tomorrow is the most important thing I've ever done, and I need to make sure I'm ready." Sissy, who had sung gospel her entire life and understood the spiritual dimension of music better than anyone, spent the next hour on the phone with her daughter. They prayed together. They talked about the responsibility of using one's gifts in service of something greater than oneself. And Sissy told Whitney something she would carry with her onto that field. "Baby," Sissy said, "your voice is a gift from God, but tomorrow it needs to be a gift to those who need it most. Sing it like you're singing for Jesus himself, because in a way, you are. You're singing for the least of these, for the scared and the lonely and the brave ones who need to feel loved." Those words settled into Whitney's spirit. And for the first time since accepting this performance, she felt completely at peace with what she was about to do. The morning of January 27th, 1991, dawned cold and gray in Tampa. Whitney arrived at the stadium 5 hours before kickoff, wanting time to walk the field again, to feel the space, to prepare herself mentally and spiritually for what was coming. As she stood at the 50-yard line, where she would sing in just a few hours, Whitney closed her eyes and whispered prayer. Not for success, not for acclaim, but for her voice to be exactly what those soldiers needed it to be. For her performance to somehow ease the pain of families watching. For her song to remind America why they were a nation worth fighting for. And then, in a moment of profound clarity, Whitney felt every doubt leave her body. She knew exactly what she needed to do, and she knew she had the strength to do it. The voice that God had given her, the voice that had been trained by her mother and refined through years of performance, was about to be used for its highest purpose. Not entertainment, not acclaim, but healing. Super Bowl 25, January 27th, 1991. As Whitney Houston walked onto the field at Tampa Stadium, 73,000 people rose to their feet, but the cheering was different from typical celebrity appearances. There was an anticipation in the air, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something significant. Whitney was wearing a white tracksuit with an American flag sewn onto the sleeve, her hair pulled back simply, no elaborate costume or theatrical presentation. She looked less like a superstar and more like someone who was there to do important work. As she took her position at the microphone, the stadium fell into an almost sacred silence. What the television cameras didn't show, what most people never knew, was that just before Whitney walked onto that field, she had been visited backstage by another group of soldiers. These were wounded warriors who had already returned from the Gulf, men and women with visible injuries, some in wheelchairs, some with bandages still covering recent wounds. They had asked to meet Whitney before her performance, and she had spent 20 minutes with them, listening to their stories, holding their hands, crying with them. One young Marine, who had lost his left leg to a landmine just 2 weeks earlier, had told Whitney, "Ma'am, when I was lying in that hospital bed in Germany, someone played your music. It reminded me I was still alive. It reminded me I had something to come home to." Those words were echoing in Whitney's mind as she stood before that microphone. The instrumental track began, the now iconic arrangement by John Clayton that transformed the national anthem into something both traditional and revolutionary. But for the first few seconds, Whitney didn't sing. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the music wash over her, centering herself in the moment, remembering why she was there. And then, she opened her mouth and began to sing. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light." The first notes that came out of Whitney Houston's mouth that day carried a power that seemed to transcend human capability. It wasn't just volume, though the strength of her voice was undeniable. It wasn't just technical perfection, though every note was precisely where it needed to be. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of a woman who had found the exact purpose for which her extraordinary gift had been given to her. As Whitney moved through the verses, something remarkable began happening throughout the stadium and across America. People stopped what they were doing and just listened. Football fans who had come for the game found themselves crying. Veterans of previous wars felt emotions they had suppressed for decades bubbling to the surface. And overseas, in bunkers and on ships, and in temporary bases across the Persian Gulf, American soldiers stopped and listened to a voice that seemed to reach across thousands of miles to remind them they were not forgotten. Television networks that had planned to cut to commercials immediately after the anthem kept their cameras on Whitney. Commentators who usually filled every second with talk simply let her voice carry the moment. Even the jets performing the traditional flyover seemed to time their passage to coincide perfectly with Whitney's final notes, as if the entire universe was conspiring to make this moment as perfect as it could possibly be. When Whitney reached the final phrase, "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," she did something that would become the most replayed moment in national anthem history. She held that last note for what seemed like an impossibly long time, her voice climbing higher and higher, each second adding more power, more conviction, more pure emotional force. And then, at the absolute peak of the note, Whitney smiled. It wasn't a performance smile. It wasn't calculated or rehearsed. It was the smile of someone who knew, in that moment, that they were doing exactly what they were meant to do. The smile of someone who had found purpose in their gift. The smile of someone whose voice was literally singing soldiers home. The roar that erupted when Whitney finished was deafening, but it wasn't the typical celebrity applause. This was something deeper, something more profound. People were applauding not just a great performance, but a moment of national unity during one of the most divisive and frightening times in American history. Strangers hugged each other. Veterans saluted with tears streaming down their faces. Families watching at home held each other tighter. And in that moment, for those few precious minutes, America remembered what it meant to be one nation, united not by politics or policy, but by shared humanity and hope. Whitney stood at that microphone for a long moment after finishing, her hand over her heart, feeling the energy of 73,000 people and knowing that her mother had been right. She had sung it like she was singing for something sacred, and somehow that had made all the difference. Whitney Houston returned to her normal life after the Super Bowl, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted inside her. The performance had been praised universally. Music critics called it the greatest rendition of the national anthem ever performed. The recording went to number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, a virtually unprecedented achievement for a national anthem. But for Whitney, all of that acclaim felt secondary to the real purpose of what she had done. She kept thinking about Sergeant Daniel Kirkpatrick and his unit, wondering if they were safe, hoping that her voice had given them even a small moment of comfort in whatever hell they were experiencing overseas. 14 days after the Super Bowl, Whitney received a package at her management office. It was a standard manila envelope, forwarded through military channels, with no return address and only her name written on the front. Inside was a letter, handwritten on military stationery, dated February 8, 1991. The handwriting was shaky, and there were stains on the paper that might have been water or might have been something else. Whitney's hands began to tremble as she unfolded the letter and began to read. "Dear Miss Houston," it began, "my name is Captain Jennifer Morrison, and I'm writing to you from a field hospital in Saudi Arabia. I'm writing because I need to tell you about Sergeant Daniel Kirkpatrick, who I believe you met in Tampa before the Super Bowl." Whitney felt her stomach drop as she continued reading. "Daniel was in my unit. He was one of the best young soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve with. Smart, brave, always looking out for his fellow soldiers. On February 6th, Our convoy was ambushed north of Kafji. Daniel was driving the lead vehicle. When we came under fire, he could have retreated, but he saw that the vehicle behind him had been hit and soldiers were trapped inside. Daniel made the decision to back his vehicle into the line of fire to provide cover so we could extract the wounded. Whitney's eyes were filling with tears as she read, already sensing where this story was going. Daniel was hit during the rescue. By the time we got him to the field hospital, there was nothing the doctors could do. He died approximately 4 hours later. The letter continued, and Captain Morrison explained why she felt compelled to write to Whitney. In those final hours, Daniel was in and out of consciousness. The medical staff was keeping him as comfortable as possible, but we all knew he wasn't going to make it. I was holding his hand, trying to find something to say that might bring him comfort, when Daniel suddenly opened his eyes and looked at me with complete clarity. He said, "Captain, do you remember Whitney Houston singing at the Super Bowl?" I told him yes, of course I remembered. And Daniel, with maybe 30 minutes left to live, smiled and said, "Play that for me. I need to hear that voice singing us home." Whitney had to stop reading for a moment. The tears were falling so hard that she couldn't see the words. Her assistant, who was in the room, came over and put a hand on her shoulder, asking if she was okay. Whitney shook her head, unable to speak, and continued reading. We found a radio, and somehow, miraculously, a station was playing your performance. I held that radio next to Daniel's ear, and as your voice sang the national anthem, I watched peace come over his face. He stopped fighting the pain. He stopped being scared. And when you reached that final note, when your voice climbed up and held that impossible high note, Daniel squeezed my hand one last time and whispered, "She's singing us home. She's singing us home." Those were his last words, Miss Houston. And then he was gone. Captain Morrison's letter concluded with words that would stay with Whitney for the rest of her life. I'm writing to tell you this because I think Daniel would want you to know. Your voice wasn't just beautiful that day. It wasn't just patriotic or moving. Your voice literally gave a dying soldier peace in his final moments. It gave him something to hold on to when everything else was falling away. Daniel told us in Tampa that your voice would sing him home, and that's exactly what it did. On behalf of everyone who served with Daniel Kirkpatrick, and on behalf of all of us who heard your performance from this desert, thank you. You'll never know how much it meant. You'll never know how many of us it helped bring home, whether physically or spiritually. Your voice was a gift to all of us. Captain Jennifer Morrison, United States Army. Whitney sat in her office for over an hour after reading that letter, crying in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child. These weren't tears of sadness, though Daniel's death grieved her deeply. These were tears of profound understanding. Everything she had worried about before that performance, all her doubts and fears about whether she was adequate for the moment, all of it made sense now. She hadn't been singing for acclaim or for her career or even for America in some abstract sense. She had been singing for Daniel Kirkpatrick. She had been singing for Captain Morrison and all the other soldiers who needed her voice to carry them through their darkest hours. And somehow, impossibly, her voice had done exactly what it needed to do. It had sung them home. Whitney Houston never spoke publicly about Captain Morrison's letter or about Daniel Kirkpatrick's death. It was too personal, too sacred to share with the world. But those who were close to Whitney noticed a change in her after receiving that letter. She approached her performances differently, with a deeper sense of purpose and responsibility. She understood, in a way she never had before, that her voice wasn't just entertainment. It was medicine. It was comfort. It was hope made audible. Her mother, Sissy, noticed the shift immediately. Something happened to Whitney after that Super Bowl, Sissy later recalled. She stopped performing for applause and started performing for the people who needed her voice the most. She would say to me, "Mama, I'm singing for the Daniel Kirkpatricks of the world. I'm singing for the people who need to hear that someone sees them, that someone cares." The recording of Whitney's Super Bowl performance became the fastest-selling single in American history at that time. But Whitney insisted that all proceeds from the single go to military charities, specifically to organizations supporting families of fallen soldiers. She never took a cent from what became a multi-million-dollar recording. "This isn't my money," Whitney told her management team. "This belongs to the people who gave everything. I was just the voice. They were the heroes." In 1992, Whitney established the Daniel Kirkpatrick Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing educational support for children of soldiers killed in action. She funded it personally and anonymously, never seeking recognition for her contribution. It was only after her death in 2012 that the extent of her charitable work for military families became public knowledge. Captain Jennifer Morrison and Whitney Houston eventually met in person in 1993, when Morrison had completed her military service and returned to civilian life. They spent an entire day together talking about Daniel, about the war, about the power of music to heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. Morrison told Whitney stories about how soldiers overseas would gather around radios and tape players to listen to her music, how her voice became a symbol of home and hope in the darkness of war. "You have no idea how many lives you touched," Morrison told Whitney. Daniel wasn't the only one. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of soldiers who held onto your voice when they had nothing else to hold on to. Whitney cried throughout that meeting, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the gift of knowing that her voice had mattered in such a profound way. The Super Bowl 25 national anthem performance has been replayed thousands of times over the past 3 decades. It's been studied in music schools as an example of perfect vocal technique. It's been analyzed by historians as a cultural touchstone of the Gulf War era. It's been celebrated as one of the greatest performances in American history. But for Whitney Houston, it would always be about something much simpler and much more important. It was about 7 words the young soldier had said to her in an empty stadium. "Your voice is going to sing us home." Those words had transformed a performance into a purpose. They had taken a talented singer and turned her into a healer. They had shown Whitney that the extraordinary gift she had been given wasn't just for her own success or satisfaction. It was meant to be given away, to be used in service of others, especially those who needed it most. When Whitney Houston died on February 11th, 2012, Captain Jennifer Morrison spoke at her memorial service. She told the story of Daniel Kirkpatrick for the first time publicly, sharing how Whitney's voice had given a dying soldier peace in his final moments. Whitney didn't just sing that day at the Super Bowl, Morrison said through tears. She ministered. She healed. She loved us through her voice, and that love carried us through the darkest time of our lives. Among the mourners at Whitney's funeral were dozens of military veterans, many of whom had served during Desert Storm. They came to honor the woman whose voice had sung them home, whose gift had been used so selflessly in their service. They stood in formation and saluted as Whitney's casket was carried past, their final tribute to a woman who had given them something precious when they needed it most. Today, at the Army Museum in Fort Benning, Georgia, there's a small exhibit dedicated to music and morale during the Gulf War. At the center of that exhibit is a photograph of Whitney Houston performing at Super Bowl 25, and next to it is a quote from Sergeant Daniel Kirkpatrick. "Your voice is going to sing us home." Thousands of soldiers and their families visit that exhibit each year, many of them sharing their own stories of how Whitney's music helped them through deployments, through injuries, through the long, lonely nights of war. The exhibit has become a place of healing and remembrance, a testament to the power of one voice to touch countless lives. Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance wasn't just a great musical moment. It was a sacred act of service, a demonstration of what happens when extraordinary talent meets extraordinary purpose, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest thing we can do with our gifts is simply give them away to those who need them most. This incredible story shows us that greatness isn't measured in album sales or awards, but in the lives we touch when we use our gifts in service of others. Whitney Houston's voice sang soldiers home, gave them peace in their darkest hours, and reminded a nation what unity could sound like. What gifts do you have that could be used to serve others? How can we all find our purpose beyond our profession? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, honor Whitney's legacy by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who needs to remember that every gift we have is meant to be given away. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more powerful stories that show how music can heal, how voices can save lives, and how one moment of purpose can echo through eternity.